I thought it was a great deal at first. I'd been scrolling through rental listings for a quiet getaway when I found it. A cabin deep in the woods, miles away from anyone else. It was advertised as a rustic retreat for writers and dreamers. The photos showed a small, weathered structure with a cozy interior. Nothing fancy, but charming in its simplicity. The price was ridiculously low, almost suspiciously so, but the reviews were glowing. People talked about how peaceful it was, how the isolation helped them find themselves, and how they couldn't wait to come back. It sounded perfect. The drive was long, and the directions vague, but I eventually found the gravel path that led to the cabin. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was that it didn't quite look like the pictures. It was the same cabin, sure, but the boards were darker, more warped, and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. There was also a note nailed to the door.
"Don't open until you're ready to take their place."
I laughed nervously. It had to be some kind of quirky guestbook thing, right? A rustic touch for an isolated retreat. The padlock on the door matched the instructions I'd been emailed. So I unlocked it, stepped inside, and tried to settle in. The first night was uneventful, mostly. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. I'd expected to hear crickets, maybe the distant hoot of an owl. But there was nothing. Just the faint creak of the wooden beams and the occasional gust of wind. It was peaceful, though. That's what I told myself as I made some tea, curled up in the rickety armchair, and started reading. The second night, things started to feel off. It was little things at first. My notebook, which I'd left on the coffee table, was on the counter instead. The front door was unlocked when I swore I'd bolted it. And then, while I was brushing my teeth, I thought I heard something, a faint knocking sound. It stopped as soon as I opened the bathroom door. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The knocking was louder now, deliberate and incessant. It didn't come from the front door or the windows, but seemed to echo from within the walls. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets over my head. But then it came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I shouted, "Who's there?" But the only response was silence. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my things and went to leave. But when I opened the door, there was another note nailed to it.
"You're not ready yet."
The gravel path I'd driven up was gone. In its place was an overgrown trail that led deeper into the woods. I slammed the door shut and tried calling for help, but of course, there was no signal. I even tried the old landline phone mounted on the wall, but the line was dead. I was trapped. The days blurred together after that. I stopped keeping track of time, mostly because it felt like time had stopped altogether. The knocking grew more frequent, sometimes even during the day, and I started finding more notes.
"Stay longer. You're almost ready. They're waiting for you.
One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the cabin. They were slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth in the living room. My bedroom door was locked, but the handle jiggled as if someone was testing it. I whispered, "Who are you?" But there was no reply. Just a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. When I finally mustered the courage to open the door, the living room was empty, but there was another note on the coffee table.
You'll take their place soon.
I don't know what they mean by their place, but I'm too scared to find out. The cabin feels alive now, like it's watching me, waiting for me to make some kind of decision. Every time I try to leave, I end up back here, like the woods are circling in on themselves. The knocking didn't stop. It came at all hours now. Mornings, afternoons, nights. Always from a different part of the cabin. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor. I searched for loose boards or animals, anything that could explain the noise. But the more I looked, the more absurd it felt. Because the knocks weren't random. They came whenever I thought about leaving. I tested the theory the next morning, standing at the front door with my packed bag. The second my hand touched the doorknob, it came from right behind me, from inside the kitchen. My stomach dropped. I'd been standing in the kitchen just seconds ago, and there had been no one there. I turned, shaking, but the room was empty. My eyes landed on the coffee table. Another note.
Leaving isn't part of the deal.
What deal? I hadn't agreed to anything. I tried shouting into the empty room. I don't know what you want. Just let me go. The cabin didn't answer, but the knocking stopped. For a moment, I thought it was over. The silence felt so complete it was almost comforting. I let myself believe that maybe I'd passed some kind of test. Maybe I was free to go now. And then I heard footsteps, soft and deliberate, like someone walking barefoot on the wooden floorboards. But they weren't coming from inside the cabin. They were coming from above. I stared at the ceiling. There was no second floor, no attic, no crawl space up there. Just the roof. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon, but the footsteps were too steady, too human. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and stepped outside, scanning the roof. Nothing. The cabin looked the same as it always had. Old, dark, and empty. Then I felt it. A presence. Someone, or something, was standing just behind me. I froze, too scared to turn around. My breath was coming in short, panicked bursts, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Slowly, I shone the flashlight over my shoulder. There was nothing there. My chest heaved as I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but the flashlight's beam shook in my hand. I turned back toward the cabin, and my stomach flipped. The door was wide open. I had shut it. I was sure of that. The heavy iron latch was loud, impossible to miss. And yet, now the dark interior of the cabin stared back at me, its gaping doorway like an open mouth, waiting to swallow me whole. The knocking started again. This time it was faster, more incessant. It wasn't coming from one place anymore. It echoed from everywhere. Inside the walls, under the floorboards, even from the trees surrounding me. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, its beam spinning wildly across the ground. I thought about running, about sprinting as far as my legs could take me. But then I heard it. A voice. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the relentless knocking with a cold clarity that rooted me to the spot.
Come back inside.
It wasn't a demand. It was a plea. Soft and almost sad. I swallowed hard, trying to summon some kind of courage. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The knocking stopped. The forest fell silent, heavy and oppressive. I picked up the flashlight and backed away towards the car, refusing to take my eyes off the cabin. I didn't notice the new note pinned to the tree next to me until the paper fluttered in the wind. My heart sank as I read the jagged handwriting.
They're already inside.
I turned toward the car, fumbling for the keys in my pocket, when I felt it. A hand on my shoulder. Not a breeze, not a brush of leaves, a hand. My blood ran cold, but before I could scream or turn around, the grip tightened, pulling me back toward the cabin with a force I couldn't fight. My feet dragged across the gravel as the door seemed to grow larger, closer, until it swallowed me in its shadow. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. The knocking stopped. The wind outside ceased, and the world became heavy. The cabin wasn't the same anymore. The walls were covered in deep scratches, like claw marks, and the floor sagged under my weight as though it might collapse. The air smelled of earth and decay, and the single window was no longer boarded up. It was just gone, replaced by blackness. A faint sound came from the back of the cabin, a low, guttural noise like something breathing, slowly, wetly. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the far corner, shrouded in shadows. It was too tall, its limbs too long, bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. But the worst part was its face, or lack of one. It didn't have features, just a smooth, reflective surface where a face should be. And that surface, it was showing me, not just my reflection, but my life. Moments I'd forgotten, choices I'd regretted, secrets I hadn't even admitted to myself. They played across its face like a flickering film, and with each passing second, I felt myself unraveling.
You shouldn't have come.
It said, its voice echoing with layers, like a dozen people speaking at once. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The figure took a step closer, and I realized something horrifying. Its shadow wasn't cast on the floor, it was stretching toward me. And then I understood. The cabin hadn't trapped me here. It hadn't been keeping me in. It had been keeping them out. The shadow reached me before I could move. It wasn't cold like I expected. It was warm, almost comforting, like sinking into a heavy quilt. My legs buckled, and I collapsed onto the creeping floor. The figure loomed over me, its smooth, reflective face tilting as though studying me. My life still played across its surface, faster now, fragments flashing by in bursts of color and sound. Then, it leaned down, impossibly close, and whispered,
"Don't forget, you agreed."
Before I could ask what it meant, the cabin door slammed shut behind me, plunging everything into darkness. When I woke up, I was standing in the forest. The cabin was gone, but the knocking, it followed me home.